Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, for whatever time zone you're in. Really delighted to be here in this exciting week. I think one of the most exciting weeks of Climate Week we've had, and a really timely conversation today, and quite looking forward to it actually. So my name is Nicolette Bartlett. I'm the Global Director of Climate Change at CDP, which is the world's only global environmental disclosure platform. And I think what's really timely about this conversation is that, this week we have Climate Week. Traditionally, we would all be in New York running around at the moment. We have the UN General Assembly, and we had China make an extraordinary announcement a few days ago, really showing that we are on this journey. We are committing to this journey in a majority of big nations to go towards net zero emissions. And at the heart of the transition, of course, is a movement out of our energy system being based on fossil fuels. And that's why today's conversation, I've been involved in at least 3 or 4, and Jérôme, I'm sure you have been as well over the last week, just focusing on this discussion as to how we do this energy transition, which is fundamental. It's a big challenge and also a big opportunity. And so excited to have a conversation while all of these actors are moving forward, the BP statistical review, of course, this week. So big announcements, big changes. So a really timely moment for us to have a conversation about how this sector can transition to that net zero future.
Thanks, Nicolette, and it's great to be with you as well today. I think this week is extraordinarily important. And as you said, the way China has set the tone gives us a lot of hope for what could come next. And I think shows how it makes sense to keep engaging on the climate roadmap. I'm Jérôme Schmitt. I am the chairman of the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative Executive Committee, representing our 12 member companies across the world, from China to Saudi Arabia, to Europe, to the US, to South America. And I think it is great for me to be sharing this conversation with you, Nicolette, in order to try to explain how we are engaging and how we are trying to improve day after day the way we contribute to the net zero pathway.
Fantastic, really great. I mean, you mentioned 12 members, so perhaps, Jérôme, for those out there who aren't aware or perhaps understand very deeply what the initiative, the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, is about, perhaps you can describe those members, because it is quite an extraordinary group, really, in terms of the range, both in terms of listed and private companies and, big national oil companies that you have as members, and of course, really very global, which is, I think, a big commendable, something to be really congratulated on, because we often have initiatives that may be very focused from either they may be focused from a European perspective or a US perspective or a Chinese perspective, but this is a very deliberately global as an initiative. So perhaps you could kind of outline a bit of that, where it's come from and why these members.
Yes, thanks, Nicolette. And I would say it is global, as you said, and it is at a very high level, as it is CEO-led. And we are trying to represent what our CEO wants to do and how they want to engage in the topic. As for all these companies, the matter is crucial. It is a CEO-led matter for these 12 companies. And yes, you are totally right. When you look at OGCI, 12 member companies, which represent about 30% of the global oil and gas production. So it's very big. We really represent a very significant share of the global oil and gas production. And what is even more interesting is that as part of our member companies, we have, I would say, usual suspects, the main European majors and oil and gas companies, the main US majors and oil and gas companies. And we have as well 3 of the most powerful, the largest national oil companies of the planet, which we very seldom talk about when we engage on climate with the stakeholders we all know about everywhere. And these 3 companies are CNPC, the Chinese National Petroleum Corporation company, which is, I think, very important, in particular in the current environment where we have heard these commitments from China this week in New York. Aramco, and as we know, Aramco is the largest oil and gas company in the planet, representing Saudi Arabia, and Aramco is a country-owned company. And then, last but not least, Petrobras, representing Brazil, which is as well a company partially owned by the government. So it's very important to have these three companies representing these three countries. And as we know, China, Saudi Arabia, and Brazil are key to the climate challenge and the way we will solve the climate challenge in the coming 30 to 40 years.
Thank you, Jérôme. And I know that over the past few years, the initiative has sort of worked out what areas it needs to work on. And I know many stakeholders, I know my CEO in particular, has really been watching this with interest. We have been one of those friendly, critical friends, let's put it that way, that is really trying to bring some transparency into the sector, really kind of encourage, nudge, push a little as to, you know, increasing that ambition within initiatives such as yourselves. And I know the last few years you've made some significant steps forward and created areas for your work. And I know very recently came out with a sort of joint commitment, the carbon intensity target. I wonder if you could just lay out for listeners, what are the areas that the initiative works in, and how do you plan to drive change together? And then something perhaps on that target. You know, we have some thoughts on that target, but I'd really love to hear it described. And of course, for us, it's a very welcome thing. And then there are areas in it where, of course, more needs to be done.
Yes. The first thing I would like to say is that we must thank you, because we need critical friends. And we need critical friends because you push and pull us, you accompany us, and you tell us the things frankly, while acknowledging that we are on a journey. And this journey is necessarily a journey where we start from somewhere and we need to progress on a daily basis. So we need your steer, and your steer is there. We have, as part of our journey, started to announce targets. And the way we did was to build short-term targets, because when you start to work on short-term targets, we can demonstrate how you deliver year after year, and you can show results to yourself, and you can progressively improve your targets year after year. So it's, you know, it's a beginning of a sliding curve. The first target we have announced is an upstream methane intensity reduction target. And this one is very important. As we know, methane is a key component of the climate equation, and a quick win. And we must acknowledge that the 12 OGCI member companies are already in the best performing pack of the industry, but still, starting from a baseline of 0.32% methane intensity in 2017, they are targeting to reduce their methane intensity to 0.25% in 2025, and have the ambition, in fact, to further reduce it to 0.2% in 2025, which is, I would say, close to zero already. And I think besides that, there is a very important part, which is the target part is important. But as part of this target, you need to have the verifying part, and therefore there needs to be a governance around it, and therefore it needs to be audited. And we need as well to improve, as we go ahead, the measuring part over the way we compute it, the estimated part. And I think this is the journey on which we are on the methane intensity, recognizing that we wanted to put something on the table, and then we need to improve it over time. And same for carbon intensity. We announced a few months ago an upstream carbon intensity reduction target, which is looking at our operated perimeter, same with a baseline of 2017 and a target line in 2025. And here again, we are really among the best performing pack within the industry. And our ambition, our target is to reduce this upstream carbon intensity from 22 kg per barrel to about 20 in 2025, which would mean 13% if we look at the more stretched part of our target. And here as well, over years, over months, we need to see how we can improve it, how we can make it better by improving the way it is audited, the way it is measured, the way we incorporate some assets or not, and so on and so forth. And then we are working in parallel on what we could do with our downstream perimeter. We are working in parallel at what we could do with our LNG portfolio. And progressively, we are trying to incorporate more of our portfolios into the way we engage.
Fantastic. And I think for me, you know, the first piece of that, the methane, I think that's absolutely critical. You know, there's been some extraordinary work done on this, both, you know, led by some of the big majors, as well as, you know, EDF, big environmental NGOs on this very critical issue, which, as you rightly point out, is the quick win, right? Let's deal with it now. It has huge warming impact. But of course it is the quick win, right? And so it's something that I really applaud the initiative and the company, you know, the member companies for going after. It should be, you know, we should be focusing on this and pushing it down as you are planning to, in such an ambitious way. It's, for me, a kind of no-brainer and win all-round scenario. But of course, it's the greenhouse gas potential that's very high but very short-lived, right? And then of course you've got the other one that's is less potential but way longer lived, potentially almost, you know, in our lifetimes, or at least from a human perspective and generational perspective, it's pretty much permanent, and that's CO2. So for us, you know, we what we would applaud about this target is that, first of all, creating a collective target with such major, you know, 30% you mentioned of the oil and gas industry together setting this target, that is massive, right? That's really to be congratulated. And I think secondly, you know, it really reminds me that a level playing field is obviously really needed for companies such as this to transition at such a scale. And so I'm really hoping that, and we would encourage the OGCI, and I know you've been doing this, is to really, for the members now to use the basis of that ambition to help support and encourage and become louder voices on the policy stage to ensure that that level playing field comes about, right? So that would be my first point. And then I think for us, it's, you know, if it's kind of the congratulation bits and then the bits where we play the critical friends, you know, I'm sure you know, but CDP is one of the 4 NGOs that jointly runs the Science Based Targets Initiative. And we have just recently gone through our process. We have some of the same members in that working group that you have in the OGCI, predominantly the EU oil majors, working with us to try and create what would a methodology look like for our sector. We have been asked for many years to bring that out, and this is kind of the result of that. And we're in the consultation period right now. I recommend and, you know, plea for people to go to engage with that, for your members as well to engage with that, and really come back to us. We also want that critical friend. We want, you know, both sides of the spectrum to really kick the tires of us and to say, this is good enough or this is not good enough, as a kind of Paris-aligned standard for what your ambition should look like. But we noted inside of that when we were doing it that, you know, the actual upstream side of things, is when you start to take a full footprint of the carbon embedded in the product and then how it is used. So in other words, scope 1 and 2 and 3 emissions, and this being a scope 1 and 2 target yours within the OGCI, the scope 3, so those, the kind of the use of the sold products as they call it, it dwarfs you know, I think we calculated in that, and I'm sure you would agree, that the sort of scope 1 and 2, so that which your target covers, is about 10 to 15% of the total oil and gas footprint. Now, of course, that's still a big number, don't get me wrong. But then you've got to deal with that 85 to 90% still, right? And then secondly, it's an intensity target. Now, we have a framework within the science-based targets for almost all the sectors that accounts for and welcomes intensity targets. But of course, then we need to be able to translate them into something which is absolute ourselves, so that we can say this would decrease the amount of emissions ultimately into the atmosphere, because that's what we need to be able to make a science-based assessment. And so for us, and then when we found that when we were asking the questions, many companies said, should we have a scope 1 and 2 target, or should we just do this combined target? And is it necessary to have many targets, given that we're quite many of the integrated companies are, you know, of course, they have a very long value chain, and they play a part in kind of the entire oil and gas value chain. And we noted that actually there's not many scenarios out there that just focus on this bit, right? That have very clear what it would take for your scope 1 and your scope, I mean, scope 2 is quite, I wouldn't say marginal, but it's much less obviously than scope 1. And when we looked at some of the IEA scenarios that we have chosen to draw the methodology from versus the ones within your methodology, that the scenarios are different. And we have looked at sort of the latest IEA scenarios, and we would say from that perspective, there's probably from a scope 1 and 2, there's a little bit more work to go, but we really welcome it. And there's probably a bit more before we really start to transition out of it. And I think finally, just to end on a positive note, we really want to encourage this. We really want to welcome it. And as we said, you know, we want to encourage, and we are hoping that at least bringing out this methodology will encourage and create the space for that movement towards both encompassing the scope 3 and then in time becoming more ambitious in the numbers that you're putting forward.
Yes. I think we do, thanks a lot, Nicolette. We do recognize, and I do recognize that it's the beginning of the journey. And it's a continuous improvement stream that we have to develop over the years. The first point I would like to highlight is that to some extent our targets are science-based targets. They refer to the Paris Agreement and to the ultimate aim of net zero. They aim at being coherent to IPCC and IEA scenario, and they are audited. So I mean, the 3 pillars are there, and we really want to make sure that the 3 pillars are there. Obviously, on each of these 3 pillars, we can improve. We can keep improving, but the 3 pillars are there and the foundations. We started to work on methane, then upstream carbon intensity, scope 1 and 2, because in this domain, we know that from the very beginning, we can find a common territory to all companies, whatever the continent and whatever the nature of the company is. And not all companies are integrated the same way. Not all companies have the same culture. Not all companies have the same market exposure, and so on and so forth. So I would say it was our own quick win. In parallel, we are as well sharing experiences. We are as well elaborating methodologies on all the value chain. And obviously, as you rightly pointed out, 6 of our members are already engaged on net zero pathways, which encompass the full value chain. And what they have achieved is shared, is debated, we are engaging, and we are trying to stimulate each other on this. And of course, we are featuring what they are doing and the progress and the journey on which they are.
Yeah, you mentioned those 6 companies, and I wonder if I can ask you if, you know, each of them have made in their framing of their targets, which are all very bold, I agree, but they're different, right? They're sometimes hard to compare, and that makes sense. They're different companies, and it's one of the reasons why we work within. I suppose it's you mentioned a few words there that would make CDP very happy, and we geek out, and we geek out on auditing, we geek out on that very dull world of accounting and transparency, right? And measuring what matters. But we have really focused in on things and information that can be comparable, right, and consistent across time. And on that consistency, we found that's why the Science-Based Targets Initiative to us was so critical, because it allowed stakeholders to decide and compare and contrast targets. I wonder if, BP, for example, has made some extraordinary announcements, not just in terms of its analysis and the statistical review, which really frames a lot of the debate and understanding within the market, but also it's made, it's in the same year and in the same period has made, big announcements about asset write-downs, right, and losses, but at the same time has set these really ambitious goals, one of them being a production target, to decrease their exploration and production by 40% by 2030, which I think is the first time an oil and gas major has made such a specific and very targeted announcement. And it's interesting to see that despite the sort of negative financial results, these commitments actually caused a jump in their share price, right? And it's given a lot of, it's like the market is beginning to see this trend. That's obviously a questionable debate, and being able to see the sort of joint pressures of I suppose, decarbonization, the kind of deflationary nature of renewable cost curves, and of course the air pollution issue growing around the world, and is beginning to price that into its modeling and really welcome this. Did announcements like BP's, does that kind of cause an interesting debate within your initiative? Do you find those to be really enriching for the conversation as a leader sort of pulls in one direction or another leader in another? Does it kind of help bringing the group to a new place?
Definitively, which is each time one of our member companies announces a new initiative, however it has been born, whether they created it their way internally or whether it was debated before and we had the ability to brainstorm on it before. In each and every cases, it gives great grounds to see how we can take example of what is being done and announced to further progress what we can do collectively. And these great announcements can be directly replicable, and some cannot due to the nature of the companies and where they are coming from and whether they depend, for instance, directly from a government which itself has its indices or whether they are listed or whether they are engaged on a specific sector or not. So we try to analyze this and see where we are in the curve, and on each topic, whether it makes sense to have this topic at the center of our priorities because we believe we can create something out of it collectively, or whether we prefer to leave that topic for a company by company engagement, making sure we share the experiences so as companies can be inspired by the others. And I think this is a very delicate exercise because obviously there are matters on which it is just fundamental to engage collectively. And we know that if we engage collectively, we will produce better results than engaging separately. And on others, we can see that it goes faster if it is one by one, and trying to make sure that the next one is inspired by the previous one. So that to try to answer your question. But maybe Nicolette, on this, your support could be and is in fact absolutely great because you are a leader in your area, and as you are a leader, you have a voice, and therefore the way you leverage your voice to embark stakeholders who are not naturally part of the discussion, it can be very powerful and very interesting for us. And for instance, and you naturally embark with listed companies and companies that are in Europe, in the US. But the more you will find positive ways to stimulate and embark national oil companies and companies coming from elsewhere, the more, in fact, it will help everybody to create a coherent journey.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, CDP, as you say, traditionally, we come from the world of listed companies. It's our first sort of mandate to drive transparency and disclosure in the system has come from the institutional investors, which obviously then lends yourself naturally to a listed company world. And that then broadly in the initial stages meant we had a very much a sort of deep penetration. We've got over 75% of the S&P 500. So the United States, Europe, it's very deep disclosure rates. But actually in the last, I would say 5 to 7 years, things have changed quite fundamentally. And I'm quite excited to see the changes because, our biggest growing areas of disclosure are certainly in places like China. Japan has always been our sort of third biggest disclosure area anyway, but Asia is really moving fast. India, all the different countries across Southeast Asia really coming into our system really high, with really high numbers now. And one of the things we've noticed there, the first thing is we started to engage with big buyers. We recognize that companies respond to their clients almost more than they respond to what their investors say, right? And for obvious reasons. And actually in other parts of the world, the listed companies don't make up the majority of the companies that make up the economy. And that's a broad sweeping statement, but really true for many parts of Asia in particular, and some parts of Latin America. And as a result, we created a procurement program. It's really driven by far. It's the biggest driver right now of disclosure within our system. And that has meant big increases in China. And because we engage very deeply with stakeholders across the Chinese government, we've also been able to bring on board into the system some of the state-owned enterprises. That's really exciting. In India, of course, many family-owned businesses. It's caused us to change our tactics in how we talk about it, how we sort of create the case, the business case for coming into the system, for taking action. And it's been we've had to learn some hard lessons because our approach has been sort of one-dimensional, and then it became, multifaceted. And our local offices will encourage us to, no, that's not how you emphasize narrative here. That is not the narrative we need to use. We need to use this narrative here. And in each country, we've learned there are different drivers, different political constructs, and so adapting and ensuring that you're able to speak to that, and understanding that the way in which we've seen what's right and what's wrong is not necessarily, universally true. And that has been very exciting. And I really want, the private companies are coming into our system. Many of them recognize the value of this journey. But I agree with you, we need to do more in that space because it's particularly in the sector that we're talking about today, it is fundamental.
Yeah, in fact, you are marvelously describing my journey as well, which is to be able to drive through different realities and different way of speaking, different dictionaries, different narratives, while trying to achieve the same goal. And it's not a straight journey.
No, it definitely isn't. It definitely isn't. And I can imagine, if you're speaking, I'd love to know, some of the companies you mentioned as members are clearly very big national oil companies, right? So that means they are state-owned, and I come from South Africa originally. We have, for example, a very big state-owned utility. That is our utility. And so it means when you're talking about what the utilities need to do, you're engaging with the utility itself, but you're also engaging with government, because those two things are intrinsically linked. Do you find that that's absolutely critical for your initiative as well? Are you needing to engage with policymakers in those countries where you have national oil companies, and is that kind of coming into the initiative, or do you find that it is sufficient to work with the stakeholders of the company itself?
The experience is that we need to work with the companies, understanding that they will have to work and deal and sometimes get the green line of their government. And therefore, we need to have to find the right angles and the right ways to help them, to bring them the support to work with their governments. And I think this is very important. And I could, give you a straight example, which is an almost obvious one. The bulk of the OGCI companies engaged in the very famous Vatican statement, which was issued a year ago. Obviously, for reasons that we can all understand, not all our members could, but what is inside is to some extent relevant for all of them.
Yeah.
And therefore, we tried to work with the member companies who were not in that ship to try to see what could be relevant to them and what were the matters on which they could convince their government to support them. And we issued our own statement, which is coherent with the Vatican State, but embarking this hidden part of the iceberg, which is absolutely key to the world of climate.
It's interesting. It's almost as if describing a parallel, an international sort of multilateral diplomatic body, really, in many ways, because I'm sure that some of those discussions sort of transversed boundaries that are out of the energy transition per se, and actually really quite cultural in nature, and that's so quite profound, and I think is one of the big values of the very international membership that you have, is that it's by its very nature, it is not just going to be driven by fundamental oil price shocks, right, and stuff like that. It's going to be a much bigger conversation. So I think that's really interesting. Coming back to the announcements you've made, how do you, the OGCI has committed as part of its kind of, this is what we're going to do together, its mission is to sort of achieve the energy transition piece, which is such a fundamental part of the Paris Agreement if we are to achieve all of its ambitions. What is the initiative plan to do to actually to do that, to shift the energy system? I get that we've got a target now amongst the members, but what else do you plan to do?
We are today engaging on several practical streams. I told you about the target stream, but there are even more important or as important other streams. The first one is the gas stream. And whatever we say, gas has a role to play, especially when and if we want to develop full-speed renewable energies. And gas has a role to play, and we have seen the role gas has played and is playing in the US, and we can feel the role gas could play in China, for instance, and in many other countries. So we need to make it right, and we need to embark all the value chain in our journey, and we need to embark other NOCs and other governments, and this is the reason why we are part of the Global Methane Alliance, for instance, as we discussed briefly earlier. So this is gas. We are as well on gas working on the technological side, on the measuring side with universities, and on the investment side with our investment fund CI, who is investing in startup, which will help to further reduce the methane leak part of the equations. Then there is CCUS, and I would say more globally carbon sinks. And we all know, I don't think anybody today disputes the fact that we absolutely need to give birth to a new circular carbon business model through which whatever carbon would be emitted could be either used or captured, stored, or neutralized. And I think it will be more and more important. And as part of the global net zero pathway, there is a negative CO2 part. So today we have embarked into a CCUS workstream, which is very important to us, where we are supporting governments, supporting industrial hubs to create their circular carbon economy business by developing CCUS project. And OGCI member companies are developing or incubating CCUS project in Norway, in the UK, in the US, in the Middle East, in China. And they are all very important because we need to kickstart this industry. And if we don't help this industry to be at scale as soon as possible, we will not be able to reduce the cost and therefore to make it commercial. Because to be at scale of the challenge, this industry needs to be commercial, to be sustainable. We are as well embarking on nature-based solution. And the first type of work we are doing on nature-based solution is to make sure that we define common guidelines, common principles, how to work well in this area, how to make it the right way when we embark in this journey. And I think this is critical. Before to do anything else, we need to work on that. And another example, which is, I would say, not last but not least, is transportation. As we all know, transportation and CO2 emitted through transportation, whether it is on the road or in the air or on the seas, it is the masterpiece of CO2 emissions. And therefore, we are working between member companies, but as well with actors all along the value chain to identify what is missing to accelerate the journey. And obviously, you could tell me this is about electrification, but I would answer you two things. Companies individually are embarked on the electrification pathway. And electrification cannot solve everything because you need to have clean electricity to have clean motorization for a very clean electrical motorization for a vehicle. Therefore, ahead of that, and in parallel to that, we need to have cleaner and cleaner liquid fuels and cleaner engines. And we are working on that among OGCI companies on how we can help. We are working on that through CI, our investment fund, to invest into technologies in this area as well. So these are examples I could give you today of the way we are embarking on the global long-term journey.
Yeah, there's so many things in what you've just said. I mean, I was moderating a panel yesterday, really, a real privilege. We had Total, Shell, great representation from there. And then we had Mark Lewis from BNP and obviously the task, from the TCFD, who always has such a great brain when it comes to these things. And then a colleague of mine in the investor research. And we had a really broad ranging discussion. And it struck me, there's something fundamental that's shifting in this sector, right? It's as these companies become, how I've always put it, something other than themselves. They're experimenting with new ways. I mean, some of them will describe it as, Shell will describe it very many times as, we're shifting from a world that was about molecules, right? We were molecule people to a world where there's a lot more electron people around. And what is our role in that, and if you look at, and then, if you look at the way in which these companies are valued, and traditionally the companies were valued about, all about the potential they had to explore and develop upstream stuff, right? That was literally the major part of their valuation. And now you're seeing a shift as these companies shift to delivering something, Total will call it sort of moving out of a commodity-based business model, right? Whereas others will talk about how they are commodities and molecules that are still so very necessary. You mentioned some that, you know, I mean, let's just think hydrogen, let's think sustainable aviation fuel. That means that that traditional role that they play is still very, very necessary. But all of the technologies we were discussing, apart from gas, which is a whole nother discussion, were they were big shifts, right? Whereas, and it was interesting, what didn't come up yesterday was the efficiency conversation, the less and less, the more and more efficient vehicles, et cetera, et cetera. And I wonder, I suppose I worry about that. We've for a very long time, so mathematically it's very logical on the transition for us to obviously need to gain as much efficiency as we can on the journey, right? And then there's the stuff that needs to actually come in that's brand new and that's structurally different. And of course, it's a very structurally different business model in the world of renewables and clean energy and the world of electrons versus the traditional world of oil, which is kind of inflationary from an economic perspective, right? Both in terms of cost, but you know, you've got different investment models, different way of valuing those things. So it's a tricky journey, but I really struggle with that. How much energy do we continue to put in the efficiency side of things when you can mathematically show that that's a very logical thing and we have to do it and it's part of the transition? And even with things like gas, which you need to be able to move, particularly in Asia, you need to move off coal, you need to move into a world of gas as a transition. But when you focus the machinery of companies and the investment community at that, do we lock ourselves into stuff, or is there more value? Are investors going to value more the things that are coming in that are new, that may look high risk now, but you can already see a trajectory for them being part of that net zero future and these other things not being? And that kind of transitional nature, I think it's a very difficult dynamic.
Yes. What I could bring to this debate are two things. The first one is the world of energy is global and complex, as you said. And therefore, the best way to create long-term sustainable value is to understand this globality, be part of it, and be part of this complexity. Therefore, not choose one and ignoring the other. And the second thing is, to your point, the value chain is about to change. The way we talk about the value chain, the way we go across it. And this is a topic we have been discussing at OGCI at length. And we call it and we describe it through our circular carbon economy value chain. And the idea is the following. If you think about our historical journey, it has been about I produce, I explore, I produce a molecule, I transform it and I push it to a market who will necessarily take it because the demand is growing. So the logic, the beginning of the chain has been upstream, on the upstream side, on the more risky side. And more what you can see through the circular carbon economy value chain, which is being discussed at OGCI, is that the story, the narrative may start from the customer. Whether the customer is a state, a city, an industry, or an individual. And first, as a customer, I will ask myself how to consume less, to be efficient, and how to consume clean, and how to consume cheap. So, and I will need someone to help me to solve this first equation, because it's not an easy one, and the answer depends on where you are and the stage you are of the economy. So someone needs to bring that service. And then that person will bring that service to help that person to be more efficient and cleaner, will help and will bring that person an energy which may change over time, may change according to the days even. And this energy will have to be cleaner and cleaner and cheaper and cheaper. And then the same person, the same service provider or solution provider, help that person to monitor its energy on a daily basis, optimize it, share it with neighbors, customers, producers across the chain. And there is a lot of value to be created there. And then the same solution provider will tell his or her customer, now we need to take care about your waste. And what is your waste, Mr. or Mrs. Customer? Your waste is CO2 because CO2 is waste. You consume energy, you emit CO2. The second waste is the heat, and there is fatal heat. And the third waste is the power, fatal power. And the more the same customer will produce for itself, for instance, renewable energy, the more he will have wasted power. So the same solution provider will help that customer to optimize this equation of waste between CO2, power, and heat, and try to find either others to use it or ways to capture it and store it through storage of energy for the power or through CC, carbon capture for the CO2, and then to store it, to reuse it. And it will be CCUS. And then finally, the same customer will want not only to be net zero, and here nature-based solution will help or could help, and therefore bringing solutions to the same customer with nature-based solution could be an angle, but the same customer will want to be net positive. Net positive from all angles, will want to contribute to restoring society. And from not only from a climate point of view or an environmental point of view, but as well from a societal point of view and a local community point of view. And therefore, when we think about our climate journey and the new value chain, we need to think about this sustainable value creation beyond mitigation.
I completely agree. I think it's so that potentially the notion that many of these companies are now bringing into the world, which is, you know, we are an integrated energy company, is the start of that journey. I suppose the challenge is going to be whether it happens at the rate of change that the market is now deciding is the rate of change that is more valuable, right? And is valuing the, you know, these companies are being valued less and less, and other companies are being valued more and more. And that's because that kind of marginal rate of change, rather than, for example, if you take a look at the penetration of renewables into the system right now, it still looks globally at an absolute level quite small. But its rate of change every year is extraordinary. 2019 was the biggest, right? It was a huge leap, and 2020 again. And that's what the investment world looks like. So if they're looking at it from a simplistic perspective, that's the bit that interests them, that for that risk and return valuation piece. And so I think the speed with which companies are going to have to move in this market, and obviously it looks very different for Saudi Aramco than, you know, than Exxon. You know, it's a very different game to be playing, or BP versus Saudi Aramco.
And some companies may choose to adopt part of the chain, and some may choose to adopt the full chain, depending on their culture, their competencies, their history, and it is respectful. It is full of respect, because not all companies will want to embrace the holistic approach in the value chain.
Agreed. And you know, I mean, for Saudi Arabia, it's a completely different conversation, right? Their oil is a totally different thing to get out of the ground than everyone else's. And so it would be a very different conversation. But of course, and that's a whole other hours conversation that we could talk about, is the geopolitics of this all and how it changes the geopolitics around the world, which has been built around molecule stuff for such a long time, and is now moving to a very different scenario in terms of the power dynamics between countries. And that's a whole interesting piece that this opens up, I think, but we've run out of time. But I think that, yeah, I think it's going to be volatile. I think it's an exciting journey. I think companies are going to, by necessity, be moving much faster than they thought they would need to. COVID is a whole other price shock into the system. But I think some of the, you know, the fundamental announcements and acknowledgements that are coming from some of these players is huge right now. And for us, you know, ultimately the aim is we need to get to a net zero economy. And by net, you know, we really mean mostly zero, with a few residual pieces, right? And that needs to be the trajectory. CDP is focused very much on standardizing the decarbonizing bit of that, while acknowledging these other elements, these kind of balancing mechanisms are fundamental to the journey. But we really encourage the continuing focus on that decarbonization space. We're encouraging the focus on the fundamental transition. We have the same companies involved with us, in fact, a bigger group of companies involved with us with our assessing the low carbon transitions framework, which we have co-developed with ADEME, the French Energy and Environment Agency, and really looking at how you need to assess this. How do you go about saying, okay, so company X has set a target, or company X says it's going to do the following. How can an investor or an NGO or a government or any stakeholder be clear that they are doing that? What am I looking for? And I think that framework really helps. There are other frameworks out there, but I think I would encourage your members to join us on that journey. We have companies in a very safe laboratory space going through road tests right now. They're either happy to put their targets forward to be kind of scrutinized, but privately, and for us to be able to say, against this methodology, it doesn't quite stack up, or it does, right? Same with this assessing the low carbon framework, really helping. We have companies going through a road test on that now, really like looking at their investment strategies, their governance in the company, all these other elements which can help a stakeholder to understand whether I can say this company is on the low carbon transition. So that kind of transition test. So I encourage your members, first of all, to continue to do the good work you're doing, Jérôme. It's fantastic. Really keen for us to carry on collaborating, but I encourage them to join that journey to report, to make their journey transparent more. It's only going to help. It's only going to help stakeholders to be able to support it and to applaud it and to lean into it, which will help in turn for those companies to be able to speed up that transition.
Thanks, Nicolette. And I understand very well what you are saying, and I think it makes an incredible amount of sense. Thanks a lot for this conversation.
Yeah, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you. Mm-hmm. And thank you to everyone who joined us to listen in. Really, I think we really only scratched the surface of what this massive topic, what we could really kick the tires of in it, and really enjoyed that. So thank you very much for the opportunity and for the discussion. And just to remind folks, obviously, if you wanted to take more look at what the OGCI is doing, you're in the website now. Take a look, come to the initiative with questions and comments. From CDP's perspective, we'd encourage you. We're in the middle of the consultation, as I've said now, on the science-based targets for the oil and gas methodology, draft methodology. We have a series of questions. We'd love to engage with you. Really happy to come and present that to your organization, virtually, obviously, of course. So the website to go to there is sciencebasedtargets.org. And if you look in there, you will see the oil and gas methodology and the consultation documents. It should really be quite clear. There's a variety of videos to help talk you through some of the more technical concepts within it. And then the actinitiative.org is the framework I spoke about in terms of how to think about assessing a company's transition and where they are on that journey. So again, thank you very much for the discussion, and please do come to us at CDP with any questions you may have as to the work we are doing in this space. Many thanks.
Thanks a lot, and bye-bye.
Bye, Jérôme.
Bye, Nicolette.